So in this video, we will be discussing the barriers to effective communication. Can you still remember the two goals to effective communication? So when we say effective communication, these are the two things. It comprises of two things. To send clear, concise messages from the sender, and then the receiver hears and correctly understand messages that is sent by the sender. If that is present, then you'll have effective communication. So there are many reasons why interpersonal communications may fail. In many communications, the message, what is said, may not be received exactly the way the sender intended. It is therefore important that the communicator or the sender seeks feedback to check that their message is clearly understood. There are barriers to communications, and these may occur at any stage in the communication process. So we already know the communication process, right? We have the source, encoder, channel, decoding, receiver, and then feedback to the source. That is the communication process. Barrier may occur at any stage of that communication, and barriers may lead to your message becoming distorted, and you therefore risk wasting both time and money by causing confusion and misunderstanding. The skills active listening, clarification, and reflection helps the communicator to be an effective communications. When you say active listening, you really you nod, you're really listening to the message. Clarification, you ask question if you don't understand, and then reflection, you think. That is decoding. So this may help, but to be a skilled communicator, which is your goal, you the students need to be a skilled communicator, also needs to be aware of the barriers to effective communication. And if you're aware, if you know what are the barriers to effective communication, you know how to avoid or overcome them. When our goal is to be an effective communicator or to have an effective communication, to be able to attain that, we need to know the barriers of to effective communication, so that if we are aware of what are the barriers, then we can prevent from using these barriers. The first barrier is the use of jargon. So when we say jargon, it means the use of unfamiliar or technical terms, overcomplicated terms. Say, for example, you use maritime jargons or maritime terms that only the maritime students or those in the maritime profession can understand. Another is, say, for the medical students or medical profession, would say to someone who doesn't have any medical background, and they would say that you have a peripheral edema. So when you say, if I'll say that to you, you wouldn't understand, right? So do not, if you are communicating to someone, make sure that you know their capacity to understand your words. Okay. Another barrier is emotional barrier and taboos. When you say emotional barrier, so some people may find it difficult to express their emotions. No, so like you want to say something to someone, but you cannot because you cannot contain your emotions. Like if you'll say that to someone, you'll cry. So you just not say it. So that is an example of emotional barrier. Others, some topics may be completely off limits or taboo. So, like for example, in our culture, we cannot really discuss sex in our family. So that is a taboo in our culture. So that's also a communication barrier. Taboos or difficult topics may include, but not limited to, politics, religion, disabilities like mental and physical, sexuality and sex, racism, and any opinion that may seem or may seem unpopular. Next barrier is lack of attention, interest, distractions, or irrelevance to the receiver. So when you say lack of attention, example here, in the teacher-student communication, sometimes the students or the learning doesn't have, or there's lack of attention to the message sent by the teacher. So that's an example of a barrier. Interest, like you don't have interests in the subject that is being discussed or that is being talked about. Distractions, say the noisy environment is a distraction, Or maybe your emotional feelings is also a distraction, internal distraction. And then irrelevance to the receiver. Your neighbor and your friend, which is your neighbor, is studying medicine and you are studying maritime course. And then you talk to your friend about maritime things and your friend is not interested. There's no relevance of what you're saying to him or her. So another barrier is the differences in perception and viewpoint. We've discussed perception or viewpoint in the previous lectures. I hope that you can still remember that. Physical disabilities such as hearing problems or speech difficulties. So, do you have a friend who has hearing difficulty or who is you cannot understand each other, right? Because your friend or is deaf and you don't know how to communicate with them through sign language. So that is a barrier of communication. You cannot send a clear message to that person because he cannot hear. Also, speech difficulty. Next is physical barriers to non-verbal communication, meaning there is a physical barrier. You cannot see the non-verbal communication. When we say, remember, what are non-verbal communication? Those are the non-verbal cues, the gestures, posture, and body language. So physical barrier means we cannot see those. Naay barrier. Let's say you are communicating via phone call, text messages, and other communication methods that rely on technology. So you cannot see the person that you are communicating with. You cannot see the gestures, the posture, the body language compared to when you're communicating face to face. So mostly we we rely on the tone of the voice. So and your hearing skills. You need to listen actively. Okay. Next is language differences and the difficulty in understanding unfamiliar accents. So language differences like say your Bisaya and the other person is Ilonggo. You cannot there is language difference. Or say another culture. If you are not proficient in English and then you're communicating to an American, then there'll be a communication barrier. You cannot express what you're feeling to that person because you cannot express it in English. Have you heard an Irish accent? They're very difficult to understand. And also even the Chinese or Koreans, they have their accents. The same as us Filipinos. When we talk to foreign person, say American, some of them cannot understand us because of our accent. Or we have that accent. Expectations and prejudices which may lead to false assumptions or stereotyping. So people often hear what they expect to hear rather than what is actually said and jump to incorrect conclusions. Can you relate to this? Sometimes when someone is saying, wala pa gani nahuman, mo jump into conclusion na dayon ka. So we already have the expectation and prejudice. You say prejudice, remember, it's a preconceived notion. So that's a barrier. So what we need is to listen attentively, carefully, and understand what they're trying to say and make them finish their message before you interrupt them. So let them finish. And then last barrier is cultural differences. The norms of social interaction vary greatly in different cultures, as do the way in which emotions are expressed. Example, the concept of personal space varies between cultures and between different social settings. So for us, when you say personal space, there are cultures na it's not they are very hesitant if someone's very close to them. Those are the barriers to communication. Be aware of them and know them so that you can prevent that barriers to happen if you want to have an effective communication. Know that communication is very important, right? It is very important for our relationship with our friends, with our families, or with our loved ones. We need to have good communication and to our workplace and studies. So, eliminating these barriers could lead to an effective communication. There will be mutual understanding, magkasinabtanay, if there's effective communication. A skilled communicator must be aware of these barriers and try to reduce their impact by continually checking, understanding, and by offering appropriate feedback.